também esta crise política, então é uma época difícil. Mas vamos ver como é que é. Eu agradeço muito, Cristina e Afonso, para aceitar o convite. A gente tem muito interesse em conhecer, em ter uma visão sobre o Brasil, e as perspectivas econômicas e políticas também.
Sim.
Então, obrigado.
Imagina, é um prazer.
O prazer
Espero que
é
seja
meu.
útil. Eu vou ficar lá no meu micro agora. Eu entro pelo meu. Boa
Então,
sorte aí.
acho que já podemos começar.
Ok.
Alexandra,
Sì.
possiamo iniziare? Ci sono già...
Si sta collegando Luca Bellardini in questo momento. Aspettiamo forse un minuto e poi partiamo.
dal vivo.
Sì, aspettiamo giusto che si colleghi velocissimamente.
Va bene. Então, Afonso, eu pensava em fazer o seguinte: eu vou fazer uma pequena introdução, depois eu deixo a palavra para você.
Perfeito.
Depois da sua relação, a Alexandra e o Luca vão fazer perguntas e também vão solicitar perguntas do público, se tem.
Ok, para mim é perfeito, Federico. Ótimo.
Ótimo. Então, allora Alessandra, quando possiamo cominciare, me lo dice lei.
Ok, appena Luca lo vedo collegato, vediamo se il video parte. Luca, riesci a mettere il video e l'audio? Invece Roman, tu sei pronto a far entrare gli ospiti?
Sì.
Sono in sala d'attesa.
Sì, tutti in sala d'attesa.
Ok. Allora, vedo collegato anche Luca, quindi Roman, quando ci dai il via che parti, partiamo.
Good evening, everyone. Sorry for being late.
Pronti, sono entrati tutti.
Buonasera, benvenuti a questo webinar dell'Associazione Guido Carli. Oggi abbiamo un prestigioso ospite internazionale, pertanto gli darò il benvenuto in portoghese, poi cominceremo a parlare in inglese. A me costa sempre fatica parlare in inglese quando ci sono ospiti brasiliani, perché però l'inglese è la lingua di questa giornata. Afonso, bem-vindo. É um prazer e uma honra ter ao senhor hoje aqui na Associazione Guido Carli para escutar a sua visão sobre o Brasil. Agora, o idioma oficial desta conferência vai ser o inglês, então vamos tornar no inglês. So, welcome everybody. Today we will have a picture about the Brazilian situation. Brazil is an extremely important country, the fifth biggest country in the world, fifth country by population, and traditionally linked to Italy. So we are extremely interested in knowing the view from one of the most acknowledged Brazilian economists, Mr. Afonso Pastore. Mr. Pastore has been governor of the Central Bank of Brazil. He has been secretary of the Treasury of the São Paulo state. He is one of the Brazilian economists with the highest reputation, and now he is founder and president of Alfonso Celso Pastore Associados, a founder and member of the board of directors of CDPP, one of the most influential Brazilian think tank. He has been awarded by some prominent Brazilian economists with the book Economia con rigor, homenagem a Afonso Celso Pastore, with some of the most important, some essays by some of the most important Brazilian economists. So it's really a pleasure to have you with us, Afonso. I would like to ask you, today the topic is overview on Brazil economic and political challenges. These challenges are even more difficult because of two reasons, at least. One is the COVID-19, which nobody expected and hit the world in a very furious way. The other issue is the uncertainty that all the world is facing. One of the friends of our associazione, Lord Mervyn King, wrote a book named Radical Uncertainty. And it's very difficult to lead a world where the future is so surrounded in the fog. So I think that your speech will be a very important one, because we are living in very difficult times, but it's important to try to see the horizon and to try to understand where we are going, where Brazil is going. Afonso, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Federico. I'm very happy to be here. Let me just tell you a small story. I knew Guido Carli. I met him once. I think, if my memory is not betraying me, it was back in 1991 in the Bangkok IMF meeting. There was a dinner for several personalities there, and I don't know what was the reason for me to be invited to that dinner, but I remember Guido clearly at that situation. So it's a pleasure to be in Guido Carli's association and to be associated with you with this discussion about the Brazilian economy. So thank you very much about that. Second, just a small comment while I am sharing my screen. Host disabled. I need someone to enable me to share my screen. Please.
I don't know whether Alexandra has the presentation, if she can share it, maybe.
If possible, I would like to, otherwise Alessandra can do that, but I'm not able to. You say that the host has disabled me to participate in sharing the screen. Anyway, Alessandra, you please put it. And
yeah, we'll try to fix this very shortly.
Okay. About Mervyn King, about the book, The Uncertainty. I was impacted by that book. It's a very interesting book written by a former president of the Bank of England and by John Kay, Radical Uncertainty, in which they start with the idea of measuring probabilities in a nicely way written about that. And then entering into the discussion of how uncertain our decisions in the economy are. And we are assuming that we know things that we simply do not know. And they insist a lot during that whole book that we are living through uncharted waters, in the sense that we really don't know exactly what is going on. And I am certain that this COVID-19 crisis has put us in a situation of extreme uncertainty, and it's going to be it's a challenging period for all of us in the world. But now here I have. Can you see something appearing there?
Yes.
Okay. I will certainly concentrate a lot on the present stage of the Brazilian economy, but let me make a little bit of history here in one or two slides. Once upon a time, there was a country called Brazil that everybody thought that it would be growing very, very fast. Like the Asian crisis, like China today, like South Korea, between the 50s and the 80s, Brazil grew a lot. Then we enter into a period of low growth. We are trapped in a low growth and high inflation traps. That was the 80s. I will make a reference about that because then a new Brazil started. It started when Cardoso was elected president. Indeed, it started a little earlier when he was the finance minister of his predecessor as the president of the Republic. And he started to do the Real Plan. That was a set of monetary reforms, fiscal monetary reforms, microeconomic reforms that really allowed the Brazilian economy to recoup economic growth on the basis of a very disciplined fiscal policy that had its defects, but it was very effective in the sense of controlling the size of the public debt, reducing uncertainties, and allowing the country to grow more. Later, he was succeeded by Lula. Lula was succeeded by Dilma Rousseff. And during the beginning of in 2011, 2012, after Brazil recovered from the external crisis, the government decided to quit the commitment with the fiscal discipline. And we started seeing again fiscal deficits, and the country went into a recession, and we were caught by the COVID in a very fragile situation, in a situation in which we didn't have an economy capable of reacting accordingly to this COVID. So let me show you some figures. These are the GDP growth rates of Brazil from 1950 until now, until 2020. Between 2050 and 2080, Brazil grew at an average rate over 7.5% per year. In this right panel, you have the per capita income of several countries, built on the basis of a PPP, on purchasing power parity. This is an international calculation done by the PEN table. Brazil was growing. This is the yellow line of Brazil. This is 1980, that marks the end of this big cycle of growth. As you can see, Brazil per capita income was coming closer to the US per capita income. It was not growing as fast as Singapore, that really is now with a per capita income on PPP basis larger than the US, but we were growing even at a somewhat smaller rate than Korea, but we were growing like Korea. From 1980 onwards, this growth rate was very low, insufficient because the rate of population declined because of the demographic transition. So per capita income became stagnant, is growing very, very slowly. We were crossed by South Korea in the late 80s. South Korea now has a per capita income similar to the UK. We have been approached by Botswana and China. And in a couple of decades, if Brazil doesn't recoup economic growth, Brazil will be surpassed by India. So it was a country that had a lot of potential, We thought for a certain point that the thing could be different, but it was not. Of course, we made mistakes. And one of the biggest mistakes was here during the 60s, when the military government was in Brazil. They had the power. despite the reforms of a brilliant minister like Roberto Campos, that was the Minister of Planning, that made a lot of good reforms at that point, we failed in doing the right and the enough of the fiscal adjustment. And moreover, we failed in the creation of our central bank. Until 1966, Brazil didn't have a central bank. The monetary policy was run by the treasury in Brazil. And the intermediation was done by a commercial bank that was Banco do Brasil. They created the central bank in 1966, but it was not very effective because they didn't have independence of instruments. They say a central bank, to be really capable of doing monetary policy, they need to be independent to use the interest rate or to intervene on the foreign exchange market as much as it's needed in order to attain the target for inflation. That was not the case of Brazil. The central bank was directly financing the treasury. And we made the most of all large mistakes we have done. One was to finance a very optimistic program of growth, of investments with state-owned enterprises on the basis of borrowing abroad. That was a period in which the euro market for lending was booming. It was at the end of the Bretton Woods regime. Brazil acquired an enormous external debt. And when Paul Volcker increased the rate of interest, the country went bankrupt like many other countries. We had 21 emerging market countries that really went bankrupt at that point, up to the point in which Brazil had zero reserves. That marked the beginning of this hyperinflation or this superinflation of the 80s, in which our growth rate, as you could see here, they came to a very low level until we did the monetary reforms of the Real Plan. Now, let me stick to the Real Plan, because then I am coming closer to what Brazil is nowadays. This monetary reform had three very important things. One, Brazil didn't have a nominal anchor to stabilize prices, and the economy was indexed. An economy which is indexed and that has no monetary anchor to stabilize prices is an economy in which the rate of inflation has a life of its own. Rates of inflation follow a kind of a random walk, what we call in Brazil inertial inflation. It's an inflation that the expected rate of inflation for period t+1 is equal to inflation in t. That required an anchor. The anchor had to be sustained by a fiscal regime. We were caught by the original sin, the incapacity of the country to finance its deficit in its own currency. We had a lot of external debt, and our debt was too large for an emerging market. So we needed, in order to exercise the control of inflation, to have targets for the primary fiscal surplus. Remember that in Brazil, the rates of interest are larger than the rates of growth. It's a situation completely different from the situation in the US, where for the last 20 years, the rate of interest is smaller than the rate of growth. So you have no problem in increasing the public debt. So Brazil was at that period and is still now in a situation much similar to Italy, in which the capacity of growth require the production of primary fiscal surpluses. Well, what Cardoso started to do, let's say, we did a constitutional amendment in 1988 in which entitlements were increased. And they turned it into obligatory spending in the Brazilian economy, guaranteed by law. And since 1988, the Constitution, this rate of growth of public expenditures in real terms was 6% per year. So when the GDP didn't grow by 6% per year, so you had a situation in which the deficits would be enlarging unless we could increase taxes. And the situation that allowed it to produce the primary fiscal surpluses, which are those black bars here in the bottom of the graph, was the rise of tax revenues, to the creation of new taxes and through the increases of tax rates. It has, of course, an economic cost. The more costly is the economy, the higher are the taxes, the more costly it is for the economy, the lowest is the rate of growth. But we could at least sustain the primary fiscal surplus that allowed the debt to GDP ratio to come lower and lower and lower. It started close to 60% of GDP at the beginning of this period, and it ended 2013 55% of GDP. So it was a very successful period concerning the control of the fiscal, and it was also a period in which inflation could be under control. In 1988, due to this behavior, Brazil acquired the classification of investment grade by two international agencies. That was maintained until we lost it in 2015. Why did we lose it? This is Cardoso, this is Lula 1, Lula 2, the two presidents in the two governments maintained the target for the primary surpluses. Then during the crisis of 1928, we started maintaining the primary fiscal surplus target. During the crisis, there was some counter-cyclical fiscal policy through the reduction of taxes and increased spending. Brazil came back for a short period of time to the target in 2011, and then the government, again, Lula II at the end of his term, and then Dilma Rousseff, the next president, started to increase spending and to give more tax exemptions in order to give stimulus to the private sector. We turned it to deficits, we lost the degree of investment, and the debt to GDP climbed upwards. It was at the end of 2019, it was around 76% of GDP. It's now approaching more than 90% of GDP because the increase is on the COVID. Well, that was a period in which we had a lot of fiscal discipline. We had monetary discipline. And in a certain sense, Brazil was able to go back to economic growth. That first phase in which we are growing a lot, population was also growing a lot, 2.5% per year. So a growth of GDP of 7.5 means a 5% per capita income growth. Now, a population, the demographic transition produces a difference in the age composition of the population. There is a decline in the rate of growth, more women working, less kids per couple. So the rate of increase in population declined. It's now less than 1% per year. So a 3-4% growth of GDP means a 2.5% growth in per capita income. We could reacquire a certain capacity of growth between 2000 and 2000. Of course, we had a recession in 2002. It was a short and mild recession. We have a deep recession, even short, in 2008. The recovery from the 2008 was outstanding, essentially because we had gains in terms of trade due to the rise in international commodity prices, as I'm going to show later in my presentation. But from 2011 onwards, you see that growth again came down with a lot of fluctuations until we entered into a deep and long recession that started in 2014 and ended in 2016. The last year in which there was a decline of GDP. We were growing no more than 1% per year when the country was caught by the COVID that I'm going to enter into a moment. But before I move into that, during this period here in which Brazil was growing, there was a kind of a structural transformation of the Brazilian economy. Brazil has always been very effective in the agricultural business. Agriculture in Brazil is very efficient. It's technologically adapted to the conditions of the country. And you see that the agricultural GDP never ceased to increase, despite the natural fluctuations that you have in an activity like that. In the recession of 2008, The services sector in Brazil now is more than 65% of GDP. It's much larger than industry. We have a deep recession in industry with a very big recovery. We have a very small recession in the services with a very big recovery. When we entered the 2014 recession, the recession was large, was deep, was long, but it was less large, less deep in the services sector. It was much deeper and much larger in the industrial sector. And unfortunately, the industrial sector didn't recover from this recession. There was some recovery in the services sector, which is showing that something is wrong with the Brazilian industry. Just a note on the monetary policy. I mentioned that we have been on this regime of inflation, which is the inflation targeting. The target from 2000, I have a short period of time here, 2006 onwards. The target for inflation in Brazil is 4.5%. This is the upper and the lower bound for the inflation targeting. We have been fluctuations a little over the bound. In 2015-16, when we lost the control of the fiscal and the public debt increased like this, we lost also control of the monetary policy. Inflation went way above the target. On an annual basis, on a consumer price index, it reached more than 10% per year, when the upper end of the target was 6.5%. It took really a very tight monetary policy, started in 16, that this was the recession period that was necessary to produce in order to bring inflation down and to readjust the fiscal. And afterwards, Brazil came back to the target. And this, just for a note, is what we call the equilibrium real interest rate, or the neutral rate of interest. That has been declining all around the world. We know this in Europe is happening. We know this is happening in the US, in Japan. If you go back to 2000, I have an interval in which the several estimates of the neutral rate are. These are real rates. These are not nominal rates. In 2000, the best value, the expected value of the neutral rate was around 12%. It's now around 2%. So Brazil is also facing a declining neutral rate of interest, like it's happening in the US or like it's happening in other countries. But anyway, it's a different story from the story you use it to listen about Brazil, that Brazil was a country with very high rates of interest. That is true in the early 2000s. It's not so much true more recently like today. Well, during the period in which we had that growth, I'm talking about this period between 2002 and 2011, when we sustained decent rates of growth of GDP. That was also a period of appreciation of the real. This is the real exchange rate. It's not the nominal exchange rate. It's a trade-weighted real exchange rate in which you have the nominal exchange rate, a weighted average of the real in relation to each one of our trade partners, divided by a consumer price index, which the index which more quantity of non-tradable goods. Let's say the equilibrium, the fair value that we estimate through a model is this blue line, and the actual real exchange rate is the yellow one. You see that from 2002 until 2011, there was a big appreciation of the currency. Well, question is, the country increased growth when the currency was appreciating. What the hell is happening here? Let's say, in general, we are accustomed to listen that a more depreciated currency helps the country to grow more. And I'm not denying that, and I agree with that. But it's a puzzle that Brazil was increasing growth during a period in which the exchange rate was appreciating. Well, I mentioned to you that we benefited here from a bonus coming from China. Brazil has this strong agricultural sector. We produce a lot of commodities. Big part of the commodities are agricultural commodities, like soybeans, like beef, like sugar, which whole international prices increased because China, that was growing 6, 7, 8% in the early 2000s, climbed its rate of growth to more than 12% per year by the late 2088, 2011. So we gained commodity prices that produced a huge gain in terms of trade. Terms of trade is an index that you calculate dividing the average price of exports by the average price of imports. So from 2002 until 2011, there was a jump in terms of trade. And you see the negative correlation that there is very clearly here between the real exchange rate and the terms of trade. Let's say in a situation in which the country gains terms of trade, it's natural that its real exchange rate declines. Also, we benefited because, and let's say I don't present it here in these slides, but it's easy to pick up a correlation between Brazil GDP growth rates and the rates of growth of international commodity prices. You can easily see that Brazil's grows by more when commodity prices are rising. This is due to our structure of the economy that is fairly dependent upon the exports of commodities, like Australia. In this sense, Brazil is very similar to Australia. Now, there is a second reason here, let's say. Brazil is a country in which domestic savings are insufficient to finance high rates of growth. Partly because we have a de-saving in the government sector. The government has a deficit. It turned it into a surplus, but now is back to a deficit. And because the private sector savings are small, are smaller than the rate of investment. So every time we need to increase the rate of investment, we need to supplement the financing of our investments with the importation of external savings through deficits in current account. So this is a period in which Brazil increased a deficit in current account. Clearly, the real exchange rate depreciated. We would have a larger deficit in current account if we were benefited by this big rise in terms of trade. So that allowed the rate of investment here is on the right angle. This is 22% of GDP. Between 2010 and 2014, the rate of investment in Brazil was fluctuating between 21 and 22% of GDP. This is our net imports, which is the current account deficit. This is about 6% of GDP. But it was permitted because we had a huge gain in terms of trade that allowed exports to sustain the capacity to finance the current account. So the country could, and the country needs a lot of importation of capital in order to finance the current account deficit if the country wants to grow by more. So let's assume that Brazil decides to induce investments through an ordinated implementation of reforms that increase reduce the uncertainties of the private sector, increase productivity, and we succeed in putting our rate of investment to 22% of GDP that could produce at the prevailing situations in the Brazilian economy a rate of growth of 2.5 to 3% per year. We would need to import capital because we would have to perform deficits in current account. And to finance the deficits in current account, we need to have capital imports. We need to have capital inflows in the economy. This is directly linked to Europe. Brazil is fairly dependent on external capital, not only to finance its current account, because the external capital, when it's foreign direct investment, it comes with more machines, with more technology. It really improves the capacity of the country to grow. These are foreign direct investments of external companies situated all around the world on the Brazilian economy. This blue line, this in 2010, we had, this is the cumulative inflow, net inflow in 12 months. So $120 billion of capital inflows of foreign direct investment. It came down, it's now around 40. Where this foreign direct investment comes from? Around 70% of that comes from Europe. A big part of the European investment comes from Italy. So Italy is a country that really has a long tradition of investing in Brazil. Pirelli, Fiat, I'm just mentioning some of the companies, which are Italian companies, a long time located in Brazil. Well, Europe is in a recession now. Europe is going to come out of this recession because you are treating the COVID much better than other countries are treating. Because the European Union, I mean the Euro area, had the clever idea of creating this European Fund of Investments with the $750 billion, 360 in investment, direct investment, 390 to finance infrastructure investments in countries like Italy and Spain, which are countries that are growing less than Germany or less than the frugal countries like Holland, like Netherlands, like Belgium, like Norway or whatever. But since Europe is in a recession, we are having a certain reduction of foreign direct investments. In the last 12 months, they are no longer 80 billion, they are 40 billion. So our capital account is really coming down for a certain, due to this kind of, I think it's a cyclical movement, it's not a long-term movement. This is portfolio investment. Remember that we acquired the degree of investment in 2008. In 2008, you see three big chunks of big foreign direct portfolio investments in fixed income and in equities. Around in 2008, $40 billion inflow. Around 2010, $70 billion, then $20 billion, then $50 billion. In 2015, Brazil was downgraded. We are no longer investment grade. We had an outflow. It was large in 2016. It reduced during the COVID. We were scared for some time because early during the COVID in 2020, we have 1 year ending in January, February, an outflow of almost $60 billion. Partly this was reverted, partly because we have foreign direct portfolio in equities coming back and portfolio in fixed income coming back. So am I suggesting that we may have some difficulties with the balance of payments? I say no. This is the picture of the balance of payments as a whole. This blue line you see here is the current account deficit in 12 months ending at each point. So around 2012, Brazil was making a deficit in current account of $80 billion. But due to a combination of portfolio investments plus foreign direct investments, we had in the capital and financial accounts an inflow that was 120, 160, a big surplus in the balance of payments, which are these lines here, larger than the deficit in current account. We had two episodes of large surpluses in the balance of payments. One close to 2008, in which there is this first hump here. The central bank was buying reserves that were at $50 billion at 2006. They climbed to $200 billion in 2008 when the country was caught by the external debt, the external crisis. Then they came up again, the surplus in the balance of payments. The central bank bought those excess reserves and brought the reserves from $200 billion to more than 350, where they are now. 1 year ago, our capital account was already coming to zero or to negative. The current account was still at 40, so we had deficits in the balance of payments. Now, I showed you that we don't have a beautiful picture about international capital flows, but we have some capacity to maintain the capital account with a very small deficit or even with an equilibrium when the current account is going to a small surplus next year. Why this small surplus? First, there is some recovery in the world economy. The commodity prices are rising, which is helping exports. And second, Brazil economy has decelerated. How much have we decelerated? These are the per capita incomes. This is the recession of 2016. We haven't recovered per capita income before. Then we are caught by COVID. This is how we are going to end 2021. Our per capita income is below the level it was before. So private consumption has gone down. Private consumption has gone down and the government had to increase spending. Let's say we were in 2016, knowing that we have a fiscal problem, a very important fiscal problem, the government approved an amendment on the Constitution to create a spending on ceiling, a ceiling on spending. Spending is frozen in real terms. We would be shifting from deficits in primary deficits to surpluses, but we were caught by the COVID. The debt to GDP that was going to have this path of peaking at 80% of GDP and then declining, given the deficit we had to do in 2020, jumped from 78% of GDP to more than 90, and this is the debt to GDP ratio now. So when I started my presentation, I said that Brazil was caught by the COVID in a very fragile fiscal situation. We were caught really in a very fragile, in which we didn't have capacity to do what the countries have done. Because of that, the index of uncertainty in the economy went up. When it goes up, it brings the rate of investment down, and then the economy grows by less. And because of that, we had really risks increasing in the Brazilian economy. One of them was the rise in the steepness of the positive yield of the interest rate curve, of the yield curve. Let's say the difference between the 10-year rate of interest, the 1-year rate, that between 2019 and 2020 was fluctuating around 2.5 points of percentage. After the COVID is fluctuating around 5. And the real has depreciated much more than the median of the emerging markets. This is the distribution of 20 emerging markets compared to Brazil. So Brazil really, the risk produced a flight of capital from Brazil to abroad. You saw that picture in the balance of payments. And we increased the cost of the debt to the crisis. What are we now with the COVID? We didn't do what Europe has done. Let's say when the pandemics started, countries started to buy options of all possible vaccines. Pfizer, Moderna, Oxford, Johnson & Johnson, whatever. If that comes true, it's a good bet. You had the vaccine available. You need to vaccine 100% of the population more than one time. Brazil didn't do that. So what is happening is that we are now being caught by the second wave. We have a vaccine that has a lower efficiency. It's 50%, around 50%. It's the lower bound. And we don't have coverage enough to vaccinate the entire population. This produces a rise in unemployment. The rise in unemployment could be matched if we were like the US, an economy that has a low rate of interest in relation to the rate of growth, then a country that holds no limitations what the country can do with the fiscal policy. We could increase spending. We could do that. But we have a public debt that is coming close to the unsustainable. So if we add another deficit close to this one, this is not going to be the debt to GDP path. Worse than this one is going to happen. And if you have a worsening here, you should expect a worsening on the risk premiums, on the yield curve, and on the depreciation of the real. And this could bring more inflation. The central bank will have to rise interest rates. So the effectiveness of monetary policy has limits. Most of all, the biggest difficulty of the Brazilian economy is the nature of the government we have here. Let's say we have a populistic government, like many in the world, a president that is very similar to Donald Trump. He looks only to his popularity. He is confrontational. He doesn't make negotiations with the several political forces in the Brazilian economy. He was denying that the COVID needed lockdowns or needed protection for the society. He was not paying attention to the cost of human life. They didn't do anything on the vaccine ground. They send away 2 competent ministers of health and put there a general, 4-star general from the paratroops group of Brazil that really doesn't understand anything about health. So we are pretty much uncovered. So we should expect Brazilian economy, given the second wave, which is a very strong wave, unfortunately, to decelerate its economy even further. It's going to be difficult. It would be difficult for any government in the world to have zero reactions of help to people that are have low assistance in the economy. I mean the unemployed. The absolute level of poverty in Brazilian economy hits around 35 to 40 million people. So some transfer of income is needed. But, and I assume the government will have to do that. But in order to have to do that, given these fiscal constraints we are facing, we should have to cut other spending. And cut other spending means, on the view of the present government, political costs that I doubt they are willing to incur on those. So I see the Brazilian economy facing a very difficult situation at this point. And it's even more unfair to what I see in the world. And this are going to be my final words here. I saw the Asian countries reacting. They are facing a second wave, like Japan, like Korea, like China. I have been seeing Australia and New Zealand are countries that could control effectively much better than Europe, much better than the US, the incidence of the COVID. And recently they signed this new trade agreement on the Pacific area that creates capacity for the countries to grow. I saw what has happened in Europe. With some hesitation, Britain decided to make a lockdown. The other countries did a lockdown, like Italy did it, France, Spain, Germany. They lock it down, they control, they flattened the curve of incidence, and they are entering into the vaccination. But while they were doing that, they were also creating this fund of investments in the countries that have lower capacity to grow, in order really to create more sustainability in the monetary union of the euro that will permit a more even distribution of growth amongst the countries in Europe. So Europe will recover, and Europe is going to recover fast. In the US, fortunately, the people chose Biden and not Trump to be the president. I think Biden is much better. He's not populistic. And I think he's going to use the fiscal stimulus in a sense that the US can allow to use. So the American economy will tend to recover faster. And Brazil is lagging behind. This is my complaint against that. We were a country that had an enormous capacity of growth. We throw it away. And we are losing a very important opportunity at this time, which the time in which all countries around the world that are doing an effort to recover the economy. And unfortunately, our effort in this area is lagging behind the world. So I'm a Brazilian, so I have to complain. And it's sad that I see that. And I congratulate you guys in Europe that are doing a much better job than we are doing here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pastore, for your very extremely interesting speech and presentation. I am probably finding out, you were speaking about the Brazilian government, and probably I'm becoming aware that we have no government at all in these hours in Italy, because we are getting through bad crisis. So let's see what happens. I'm a bit less optimistic regarding Europe, because I think that we face very difficult challenges too. But let's hope that you are right and that Europe will recover fast, because particularly here in Italy, we really need grow the economy to grow again, because it's a long time that our economy is not performing very well. However, we are focusing on Brazil, and I really appreciated all your presentation. Now I would like, because I already know that Alexandra Arsova and Luca Bellardini have some questions, and I would ask them to lead the discussion, and I ask the audience to ask questions to Afonso, because we have an incredible opportunity to have him with us today. So, Alexandra, please.
Hi, good evening. Thank you again for your exhaustive explanation and speech. Very, very interesting. So I will go back to your last statement about the recovery plan and all the stimulus we have here in Europe. And I think also, as Federico told us before, that we are improving on many things, and because investments are important to recover the economy. And I think we are all very proud here in Europe that the major chunk of this recovery fund, of the 150 billion euros, are dedicated to the Green Deal, so to energy transition and to making the economy more green. Do you think a similar kind of investments addressed to the green economy could be a way to revitalize the Brazilian economy? So whether it is a good point to apply also in Brazil? And then my second question is a more broader one on geopolitical and trade dynamics. So you mentioned a lot investment by Europe or commercial ties of Brazil with other countries. So what about the other South American countries? So what are the dynamics, and would you think that a sort of, maybe not a union, but tighter ties with other South American countries will help to bring back the growth in South America and especially in Brazil? So thank you.
Okay, about the green economy. It's obvious that we have to do all efforts possible to reduce the emissions of gases, to preserve the nature, to preserve the Amazon region. Let's say Brazil agricultural sector grew on the Cerrado area, that is the states of Mato Grosso. That was an area, was a land that was thought for decades that was unsuitable to agriculture. Now the soybeans of Brazil are producing in Cerrado. We are increasing productivity per unit of land because Brazil invested in research, biological research. So Brazil is one of the countries with the largest increase in yield per acres cultivated, like Japan, like countries that have shortage of land. So the private sector is perfectly in favor of doing attitudes to preserve the forests, to maintain the Amazon. This consensus is in the Brazilian population. I think the financial market is clearly motivated by that. When they offer opportunities to foreign investors, they are going to follow that line. What I don't see is the government of Brazil doing that. This I don't see. A lot of military people in the government, they think that the Amazon is Brazilian. The military should have the Amazons for strategic reasons, whatever they mean by strategic. And the fact, unfortunately, is that we are reducing the area, the green area of the Amazon. Unfortunately, Brazil is being punished. And today, Macron has stated in a newspaper here in Brazil, let's say, if we eat Brazilian soybeans, we are destroying the Amazon forest. I think, let me tell you, I'm a Brazilian. Please put a lot of pressure on the Brazilian government in order for us to really become serious about the way to do this kind of direction of economic policy in the country. Now, concerning the integration here in South America, we have a South America disease, which is called protectionism. There is protectionism all around. There is protectionism in Argentina, in Uruguay. I remember when I was a kid, I have 25 years old, I was unemployed in Sao Paulo. I went to Uruguay to have a temporary job with the American government to do some research there. They have one factory of Ford that recently left Brazil that used it to produce 360 cars a year under a huge protectionism. Let's say 1 car per day. It didn't make sense. It's a country with 3 million people, but they decided that was fundamental to keep the level of employment high. And this is the reaction we are having in Brazil when Ford ultimately decided to leave Brazil. I say they are not leaving Argentina because Argentina is also as protectionist as always, as all countries in Latin America are. But Argentina has a better fiscal system, which is less distortive than the Brazil fiscal system. So Ford decided to stay in a country in Latin America which has less tax distortions than Brazil, so they decided to stay in Argentina. But there is protectionism here, in Peru, in Colombia, everywhere. So how the hell can we integrate economies that could benefit from the economies of scale, could have a monetary union in which we reduce tariffs amongst ourselves in order to trade more, in order to explore comparative advantages, if the lobbies and the vested interests in the continuation of the status quo around Latin America are as strong as they are. So we made an attempt with Mercosur. And there is this attempt of integrating Mercosur with the European economy. That started, who started that was Cardoso. But that failed. Let's say we need here a new government. We need new ideas. We need someone that is less ideological like the present government. Someone that really thinks that you need to increase efficiency. You need to increase investments that reduce the concentration of income distribution. You need a tax system that is less distortive and more fair. So we need someone more center, less of left-wing like Lula or less than right-wing like Bolsonaro, in order to have a future for the Brazilian economy. But, you know, with the present government, I think we are miles of distance from those two goals you posed to me.
Okay, thank you. Luca, please.
Yes, good evening, and thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Professor Carli, and of course, Associazione Guido Carli and CDPP for the invitation to join this wonderful discussion. So I would like to ask Professor Pastore about two major issues. One, comparing Brazil to other BRICS countries, in particular by analyzing the effect of the so-called Washington Consensus reforms on the development of these economies, not merely under in terms of fiscal discipline, but particularly in terms of structural reforms that have been implemented in Brazil over the latest years, but maybe not as widely as Brazil in other BRICS countries. And the second question is about the so-called new economy, mainly revolved around fintech. So I was, since I'm studying financial aspects, in particular with regard to fintech, I'm also curious about what is the current state of the transition of the Brazilian economy, which has seen the services sector less impacted by the crisis, as in the presentation of Professor Pastore, how the Brazilian economy is moving towards integrating technology with the development of financial services, which aspects may be more favorable to the flourishment of fintech, maybe low interest rates, which are currently taking place, as also in the presentation by the professor, or maybe what kind of reforms are needed in order to ensure that that technological innovation may meet with financial development. Of course, one might be if I understood correctly, might be not only an easier access to credit, because I don't know the Brazilian banking system, but surely an increase in the Brazilian rate of savings, especially in the among households, or a more widespread financial literacy, as an example. So what are the drivers that might put Brazil on track with the most recent developments of the financial industry? Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Luca. About the BRICS, first, Goldman Sachs is an institution that is very good in doing advertising. They have some good economists. I can give you an example. Mario Draghi was an economist, worked in outstanding economist. So Goldman Sachs has had outstanding economists in the past. But in general, they are wrong when they look to other countries. Let me tell you, 1 week before Mexico went bankrupt, they were selling Mexico. And they decided to create this name, BRICS, Matone. It's a Matone, it's just that. Because B, R, A, C, and S, and the S was added later, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, were the countries that were booming. That was around 2011, when Brazil came out of that crisis, the international crisis. Surprisingly, growing at 7.5% because commodity prices increased. We had the bonus coming from China that allowed the country to recover. And our then president, Lula, thought that that was his miracle. It was not something that really Brazil was benefited from. Well, I have been following India. India is a complicated country because they have so many problems. But they had one which they are now willing to improve, which is how close the economy was, and it's becoming more open. Brazil has not opened at all. India has opened slowly, but they are opening. China is reverting the structure of its economy from, they have to do the transition from an economy that was an economy towards exports, with a lot of investments towards exports, producing current account surpluses, investing abroad, to an economy that has to increase domestic consumption. And that's the way it is. So they are making this structural transformation. China's growth is not going to, cannot stay at 10, 11, 12. It's going to go to 5 or whatever. It's going to converge to the world trade. But they are doing the structural changes that they have to do. Russia, for me, is a mystery because Russia is so corrupt and so entrenched with it. That type of extreme populism, which is funny from a country that was a communist country. But anyway, and South Africa is living through its own problems. Let's let it aside. I think they are trying hard, but I don't think that there is anything in common between those 4 countries. Each one has its own reality. Brazil's is different from China's, is different from, despite that there are Brazilians that think that if we could sustain the real very weak, automatically we would be doing the Chinese miracle. That's crazy. Brazil needs reforms. We need a much better tax system. We have to reduce the distortions. Let's say if I had 1 hour to talk to you about the tax system, you would be amazed how bad our tax system is in Brazil. Because of fiscal wars amongst the states, a lot of inefficiencies. We need to open the economy to international trade. We need to invest in infrastructure that is insufficient in Brazil, that produces a lot of externalities for the private sector. We need to increase competition in the country. And one of the sectors in which we need to increase competition, which is a very efficient sector, is exactly the sector you have been mentioning, which is the financial sector. Brazil has a very efficient financial sector, but the concentration, the banking concentration in Brazil is huge. 4 banks in Brazil, 2 of which are state banks and 2 of which are private banks. They have more than 60% of the Brazil deal there. It's too much. I say, how can we increase competition? Well, the central bank, one of the continuous preoccupation of the Central Bank of Brazil is to find a way to increase competition, maintaining the soundness of the system. The system has to be maintained sound. You cannot shake it. You cannot expropriate, you cannot oblige people to sell, you cannot do things like that. You need to do that in an orderly way. And the orderly way to do that is to take this capacity that the new technology creates for us, to create, well, currency which is no more currency. It's a digital currency in institutions, then in the central bank, fintechs, open banking, reforms that allow the competitors to come and to, at the fringes of the system, to start increasing competition, to put some pressure on the big banks and to reduce the concentration. Well, this is a long-term movement. It's very welcome. People in the financial sector are very conscious of that. The last 2 presidents of the Banco Central, Ilan, that was there in 2016, and Roberto Campos Neto, which are there now, they are not, Ilan was knowledgeable on that, and Campos is even more, because Campos was in the private sector, over and above being a good academic economist. He has been also very well experimented as a banker, as a treasurer of a major bank. And so he knows the intrinsicies of this system. And they are pushing the idea of the fintechs, the idea of the open banking, the creation of these digital systems of payments like PIX, which is coming in. So I see with very good eyes the direction we are taking. I think we need to be patient here because it's going to increase. I think in 10 years, you're going to see a completely different financial system in Brazil, much more competitive than it is now. But there is a certain optimum path in this direction that you cannot force it too much in order to shake the system. So I'm very positive on that. I think Brazil is doing the right things and is taking the correct approach in order to increase the competition in the financial sector.
Thank you very much, Afonso. I think that this last point is extremely interesting because in Italy we have some experience in trying to increase the competition in our financial sector without shaking it. So, and I know how efficient is the Brazilian financial sector. So probably this might be an issue for another conversation in the near future, hopefully, because this is something very interesting and important to us. I would like to thank you very much for your time and for your speech. I see that we are here almost out of time. I saw that there are many Italian friends living in Brazil following us. So I don't know whether there is anybody who wants to make a last question before we close this very interesting seminar. I see Graziano Messana, Renzo Regini, Isidoro, many Italian that have deep knowledge about Brazil. Any question?
I think there are more Italians in Brazil than there are Italians in Italy. At least here in São Paulo, the sample I have, maybe a biased one, but you know, I'm surrounded by Italians around.
So no question, I think. So Luca, do you have... Yes,
Mr. Hi.
hello.
Hello, are you hearing me? I have a little problem in connection problem. Renzo Regini speaking. How are you? Pleased to see you, to hear you. Are you hearing me? Sorry.
Yes, we are hearing you.
Yes, okay. And Professor Pastore, it's a pleasure to come back to hear you. I had the opportunity to share your speeches when I worked in Brazil for a foreign bank. So it's a really pleasure. Congratulations as well. By the way, a simple question of something that maybe the new generation in Brazil doesn't know, doesn't face, doesn't see, or I don't know, on a right way. The inflation. We had the hyperinflation. Now, absolutely, the situation is comfortable. Inflation rate is under control, surely for some quarters, some halves, probably 1 year. By the way, if the inflation, this is the question, coming to the question, if the inflation will raise consistently and widely, how and when the local central bank, Brazilian central bank, will start to raise again the Selic rate, the inflation rate, to control the inflation? What do you think about this? Thank you very much in advance.
Look, I think the central bank will raise interest rates this year. And the reason is simple. One of the slides I showed to you shows what is the real equilibrium interest rate, what we call the neutral rate. It has an economic concept, but anyway, if your economy is cool, you are disinflating, inflation is coming down, and GDP, actual GDP, is below potential GDP. So you have a low demand in relation to supply. You have a negative output gap. You need to bring interest rates down in real terms below the neutral rate, because at the neutral rate, demand equals supply, and inflation is in equilibrium. So if you have the inflation coming down, you need to bring the interest rate real below the neutral rate. Well, we know more or less where the neutral rate is. We're never certain about that. Economics is not like physics. We cannot have precise answers to that, but we know the order of magnitude. And today there is an interview of the president of the Central Bank of Brazil in the press, and of one of the directors called Bruno Serra, which is the guy that deals with monetary policy in the central bank. They are saying, well, the real neutral rate of interest in Brazil is below, the real market real rate of interest is below the neutral. So monetary policy is very accommodative, is really stimulating the economy to recover. Now, the economy is recovering. There will be one point in which this real rate of interest, the market real rate, will have to converge to the neutral. If the neutral is above the actual, they will have to rise it. So this is almost a consensus in the market nowadays. If they look to the year of 2021, if you have a consensus forecast, which the central bank publishes every week, they are telling that there should be a 100, 150 basis points hike in the Selic rate sometime, maybe in the second half of the year, maybe earlier, maybe later, depending on certain conditions which are not very clear at this point. What is clear at this point is that in the next Copom meeting, probably they will not do anything. They will maintain the rate. But as time goes by, you are going to see some normalization of monetary policy. So they will have to rise it. And let me tell you one thing, I have a lot of respect for the quality, professional quality of the present board of directors of the central bank. They will do what has to be done. They have their reputation there. They will have, if they have to hike technically, because it's technically required, they will hike. And as far as I can see that by the year end of 2021, you have a Selic rate, which is the basic rate of interest, somewhat higher than the present one. So the normalization is going to occur within 2021.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Molte grazie. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I would like to thank the audience for joining us. I would like to thank Luca Bellardini and Alexandra Arsova for the questions and the support they gave to this webinar. I would like to thank Maria Cristina Pinotti, who has been extremely important for making this happen. And of course, I'm thanking very much Mr. Afonso Pastore for this very enlightening speech. I hope that this will be the first of a cycle of webinar regarding Latin American economy and Brazilian economy in particular. The financial sector is a possible issue for next webinar. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor
Bye-bye.
Pastore.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you, Mr. Alfonso.